All right. Good afternoon. So for those joining on the Google Meet, welcome. For those joining on LinkedIn Live, that audience will build in the next about 60 seconds. So while we wait for that audience to build, another reminder, if you are with us on the Google Meet, you are more than welcome to go over and open up LinkedIn. And on LinkedIn, just find Adaptive Challenge Consulting, and the event is live and happening. So it should be easy to find. Um, but if you prefer to stay in the Google Meet, that's great as well. So just bear with me 1 second as we get the other channel up and going. And here's the other channel up and going. So we are live on LinkedIn Live, we are on Facebook Live, and we are on Google Meets. So lots of different channels right now. So today we are talking about the 5 key mindsets of leading with emotional intelligence. And I'll take you through this a little bit as we go. I'm going to try to manage both sets of slides, the slides on the LinkedIn Live and on the Google Meet. So bear with me 1 second here. All right. I hope this is going to work, but we'll find out. So let's get right into it. So today is about the key mindsets. And so one of the things that's interesting about mindsets, one of the things that's interesting about leadership development in general is that so many of the different leadership development books out there, courses out there, etc., so many of them um, think that leadership is a set of behaviors, right? HR departments can measure behaviors, they can observe behaviors, they can talk to you about the behaviors you're using. And so, because of that, so much of what's written about leadership focuses on those behaviors, right? But throughout the 90s and early 2000s, other ideas about leadership were being developed, right? Some of these were in academic circles, some of these were in community based circles. But the idea that leadership is more than just a checkbox, a set of checkboxes. If you were in our session last week, we talked about leadership trait theory, which is the idea that if you list traits that you want in a leader and you find someone who exhibits all those traits, that you have found a leader, that it's that simple. But there was more research that suggested that leadership isn't just behavior, isn't just a set of behaviors, but that leadership is also a developmental process. So, what I mean by developmental process, and then here on the slide it says developmental leadership. What I mean by that is that as we all grow, and several of my degrees deal with human development and psychological counseling, specifically psychology in education settings or psychology in adult learning settings. And so as we grow and develop, our minds think about things more complexly than they did when we were younger. It is sort of human nature. So this next slide, I can show you an example of what I mean by that. When I was a kid, I was convinced when I was going to sleep that there were monsters hiding in my closet, right? When I was probably 4 or 5, 6 years old, I thought that. If you could go back and interview me when I was 12 or 13, I would not have believed that. I didn't believe that anymore because my thinking had gotten more complex. My thinking about the reality of the existence of monsters got more complex. My feelings about my ability to stand up and turn on the closet light if I wanted to increased. And so these different things caused me to have a different mindset, right? So I'm using the word mindset as a placeholder for a new level of development, if that makes sense. So other things, by the time most folks are in adolescence, they have shifted wanting approval from parental figures or elders to their peer groups, right? That's another example of development. When I got my master's degree, I read significantly about the experience of different college students that were navigating different parts of their identity as they came to college. And so there, all of these sort of ways that students would understand their identity and grow through those were developmental in a sense, right? So I read books about the experience of LGBT college students and how for many of them, if it's their first time out of the home, they had this robust coming out experience. And so much of their life circulated around that identity that it seems really, really, really big. And then, but developmental psychologists who have studied with and amongst these communities recognize that 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, that identity will be integrated with a bunch of different identities that that person holds. And that person will have reached a more complex level of development, integrating different parts of them. Same with race, same with gender, same with other things that make us us. When we are more newly exploring these aspects of our identity, everything seems to be about that identity, right? In religious groups too, when people first join a religious group, they tend to have a lot of fervor about that, right? And then as they move on in time, it becomes a more integrated part of themselves. So that's a brief kind of examination of what I mean by development. Because most of us go from there are monsters in our closet to maybe there are not monsters in our closet to nope, there are not, to the point where I have had to reassure my children that they are not monsters in the closet. Then we go through adolescence where we shift our sort of focus, our energy from parents and elders to peer groups in terms of what's cool, what's acceptable, who I am, what I want to be, etc. And then eventually, in time, as we enter young adulthood and midway adulthood, that seeking peer external validation from peers changes and evolves and develops again, where overwhelmingly by the time people are in their 30s or 40s, they may still seek some affirmation from their peers, but they are very, very heavily scrutinizing which peers, right? They have sifted away the peers that don't fit with them anymore, right? And so we continue to evolve. So if we think about this from a leadership vantage point, leaders need to continue to evolve. That right there, that's a cliche though, right? Saying leaders need to evolve, that's a cliche. But the question is how, right? How do we get to the point where leaders can actively cultivate mindsets that are increasingly complex? There were monsters in the closet, now there are not. I need the affirmation of my peer group, now I do not. How can we get leaders to adopt the mindsets that gets them on that developmental path first before they go about building hard skills or building emotional intelligence skills, right? So in my book, I am very, very intentional about there are 5 mindsets and then there are 7 skills. And some of the mindsets and the skills sound similar, except a mindset is just that. A mindset is sort of a template of belief, a template or a set of ideas that I think is critical for any emotionally intelligent leader to have and buy into and examine, right? So these are ideas that we need to buy into, examine, and have on our journey to be emotionally intelligent leaders. And then the next part of the journey is how do you build some skills on top of that, right? So in a metaphorical way, the mindsets are like cultivating the soil, and then the skills are planting different plants, right? So we have to have a rich soil that contextualizes this. So here are the 5 key mindsets from my book, Leading with Emotional Intelligence. The 5 key mindsets are: we never become the perfect leader. Everything starts with listening. Perspective taking is valuable. All people are deserving of human dignity, and authenticity matters. These are the 5 key mindsets that I have identified over 25 years of formal study, informal study, work with clients on what makes effective leadership. And coming up with this list was challenging, and it took some time. There were some things that jumped out of both kind of the academic literature and my experience working with clients. And so, like, for example, number 2, everything starts with listening. I'm convinced that listening is one of the most critical parts of being a leader. And if you've read my book, or if you want to skip ahead, the first skill that I mentioned when it comes time to build skills is about listening. So listening, I'm addressing it as though in this section as a mindset, because if you have to believe that all great leadership, that all good motivation, that all of this starts with listening. And if you believe that, then practicing the skill of active listening, which takes its own time and journey and sort of skill building time. I wish there could be a montage like there are in movies where you can just do a year's worth of work on learning to be an active listener with some cool soundtrack in the background, right? But so listening, that's one of the ones that jumped out of everything. But there's other ones of these that I had to dig for more in terms of both what academic literature talks about, what corporate literature talks about. So corporate literature, whether it's NACE, the National Association of Colleges and Employers, which does research on the employment space, the BLS, Bureau of Labor and Statistics, that gives us information about the working world, careers that are on the rise, skills that are needed. Harvard Business Review regularly kind of updates their list of what are needed by leaders. So there are some sort of trade things, some academic things, and then my experience that have helped me build this list. So I am going to mention my little icon here. If you've been in any of my sessions, you'll know that from time to time we see this icon: diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Because when I mentioned these 5 mindsets, uh, many of these mindsets are layered. Many of them are layered. They are layered by our gender, by our race, etc. When we get to authenticity matters, one of the things that I talk about in my book is that being authentic is something people want from leaders. And if I'm in a space that's been dominated by white people, or maybe even not physically dominated by white people, but dominated for a long time culturally by white norms, and if I'm not a white person, being authentic comes with a different cost. There's a different price. Same with men and women. If I'm in an environment that has been overwhelmingly where the culture has mostly been shaped by men, even if men aren't in all the leadership positions. One of my clients has a president that's a woman, but the last 7 presidents were men, and the culture of that organization still is very influenced by the cultural norms of men, right? Which is not bad necessarily, but it's always incomplete. It's always incomplete. And so when I talk about authenticity, for example, I recognize that for women in particular, for women who are also Black women, Latina women, etc., other Indigenous women, other women of color, that the price to be authentic, the social capital price that it takes to be authentic, is higher than the price it costs me as a white man. It just is, right? So I invite all leaders to be as authentic as is safe for them. And if the phrase "as authentic as is safe for them" seems confusing to you, that could be a function of privilege. That could be a function that you've not had to think about how authentic you can be and whether that's safe, right? I do think that with men, that men police other men when it comes to emotions, right? And so we could talk about that at some point too. But overwhelmingly, when women are paying the social capital, and in particular women of color are paying that social capital, there is a feeling that they are reflecting an entire community, that their actions are going to be ascribed to people that match their gender and or their race, fair or not. And spoiler alert, it's not fair, but that pressure is still there, right? So let's go a little bit further into this. So these are, the question is, how did I start this list? One of the things is different clients I have, I do surveys. One of the things we have on our website is the ACC 10 factor assessment, where we work with leaders and their teams, and we do sort of a 360-degree assessment where the leaders take an assessment on their own efficacy across 10 different factors that we've identified. And then those who they lead take a similar assessment, rating their supervisors or their leaders. And then my team gets in there with the gaps, right? And so we create, this is just an aside, but we create what's called a gap map. And in the gap map, lots of times we find what I call the humility gaps. I love a humility gap where somebody supervises 12 people. The person, the leader, self-reports on a scale of 1 to 5 that they are a 3 in terms of intercultural competence, maybe just a 3. But their team rates them as a 5. So that's what I call a humility gap. There are other gaps that are not the humility gaps, where the leader might believe they are a very effective communicator and their team might not agree to the same degree, right? And so part of how I arrived at this list was when I do this kind of assessment with clients, when I listen to those who are being supervised and those who are doing the supervising, themes come up. And every single one of these 5 key mindsets has an opposite, which is a theme that I hear when I'm working with clients. So let's look at the opposite of each one. The opposite of the first one. So the first one is we never become the perfect leader. Oh, there's a slide explaining what I just explained. So this is again just reiterating that that coming up with this list has been driven a lot by what I've heard team members and staff members of organizations I've worked with say about the leadership within their organization, sometimes specific leaders, sometimes the leadership culture, etc. And so here we go. This is the list again. So what's the opposite of each of these? The number 1, we never become the perfect leader. The opposite of that is my boss never admits to mistakes. My boss can never admit to mistakes. This is very common. It's very common. There's pressure on leaders to not admit mistakes. We see this in the political sphere. We see this in universities, colleges, K-12 systems, corporations, that people have a hard time admitting mistakes. They feel embarrassed. That's a real feeling, right? And it's a thing we've got to deal with. We've got to talk about. They again, when we think about social capital and gender and race, admitting to a mistake takes courage for anybody, but it takes courage and some extra social capital if you're the supervisor and you're a woman, if you're also a woman who's a Black woman, a Latina woman, a woman of color, Latina, etc. So understand that there is a natural sort of reason why many bosses and leaders resist admitting to mistakes, and yet it is something that we have to shift our mindsets on. We have to shift our mindset to none of us will ever be a perfect leader. And so some of you are familiar with the growth mindset. This is what we're talking about, right? The idea that none of us is a perfect leader. It doesn't matter how many syllables are in your title, vice president of this, chief operating officer of this, whatever. You're never the perfect leader. And the more you can demonstrate that you're comfortable being an imperfect leader, the more your followers will respond. And again, I cannot stress enough that this is consistent with some of the background literature and research in leadership, and borne out in big, robust, full color, four-dimensional, four-part harmony ways with clients that I've worked with for the last 20 years, 25 years, is that this is a constant theme, is that people being supervised desperately want their leaders to be able to say, hey, I messed up, and or hey, I'm not quite sure what to do, and then just follow it up with, but we're going to figure it out together. Messing up is part of life. Not knowing all the answers is part of life. We're going to figure this out together. That's the leadership that most people want. So number two, everything starts with listening. What's the opposite of that? If anybody's in the chat wants to just chime in, what's the opposite of listening? I mean, I think that should be a pretty obvious thing, but this is something I hear from people all the time. My boss doesn't understand me. My boss doesn't understand me, right? Or my boss doesn't listen to me. I think I meant to edit this and say my boss doesn't listen to me. But in some of my workshops that I do a lot of workshops with the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator. Extroverts and introverts are one of the most commonly understood, but also misunderstood aspects of the Myers-Briggs. And if you've ever seen any of my Myers-Briggs presentations, you recognize that I talk about the leadership skill of listening. And I talk about the leadership skill of listening as separate from making people feel heard. That listening is one skill set, but making people feel heard is a different skill set. When I'm talking about introverts and extroverts, all of us, whether you have an introvert preference or an extrovert preference, all of us need to learn to listen better, the listening part, and all of us need to learn to make others feel heard more effectively. But I'll tell you that people with introvert preferences have an easier time learning that first skill, an easier time learning the actual listening skill. Not all introverts are good listeners necessarily, but people with introvert preferences have less barriers to learn that listening skill, but perhaps more barriers to showing their listening partner that they are listening, to showing that. Meanwhile, people with extrovert preferences typically have a harder time developing the skill of listening because we talk so much, right? But once people with extrovert preferences do master the skill of listening effectively through active listening and other techniques, their ability to let others believe they're being heard tends to come pretty quickly, right? So these are two skill sets that are critical for every leader, and yet most of us have a preference for extroversion or introversion. There are ambiverts out there, and we can talk about that in another workshop. But the bottom line is that people believe that their bosses aren't listening to them. And I'm sure on this call, many of you have had that experience, believing my boss is not listening to me. I had a boss once, and I explained to them that I was going to a professional development conference, and that I was part of the board of this national organization, and that I'd be back in a week, and whatever. 2 months later, my boss said to me, hey, I think we should start really getting involved in such and such organization. And that's the organization that I was already on the board of, right? And so it was very clear that the person wasn't really listening, right? That they weren't, number one, they didn't listen, and number two, they most certainly didn't make me feel heard, right? Okay, so number 3, perspective taking is valuable. The opposite of that is management doesn't understand me or us. Perspective taking, and this shows up in the book in a couple of ways, because perspective taking is a mindset that we ought to be perspective taking, and then it's a skill you can practice. Although when I talk about it in the skill part, I talk about intercultural competence, right? I'm using that frame to talk about perspective taking. So it's a mindset. In other words, the mindset is imagining the lives of other people who aren't like me is valuable for me as a leader and my growth as a leader. That's a mindset thing. So I'm going to say that again, that the exercise of me wondering about the lives of people who are different than me and trying to stretch my mind to other perspectives, and that I believe that's important to do, that's a mindset. It's a mindset. You got to have that mindset before you actually start practicing doing it. If you start practicing doing it because you think you're supposed to, it's not, the skill is not going to develop nearly as effectively. And I hope this makes sense, that the mindset has to precede the skill, right? And so again, the idea that perspective taking is valuable, I will never understand personally, for example, what it's like to be a non-college educated person. That's something that I once was, but I have forgotten what that was like. I will never know the experience. I will never understand the experience of, for example, a woman who is both transgender and black. Right? I am cisgender. I am white, and I am not a woman. So there are multiple ways in which I can't really understand that person's perspective. And a key mindset of leaders is me believing that even though I can't ever understand it, that I should try. That good leaders try. Try knowing we are going to fail, right? That I will always, always, always fail in stretching my imagination to wonder about the experience of autistic people, or stretch my mind to wonder about the experience of people who need wheelchairs to get in and out of buildings, or stretching my mind to, again, a woman who's black and transgender, stretching my mind to things that make people them, that I don't have experience with. I'm always going to fail, but the best leaders know they're going to fail and they keep trying because it's worth, because it keeps the mindset fresh, right? Hope that makes sense. Number 4, all people are deserving of human dignity. The opposite of that I hear over and over and over again is people not feeling valued at work. People not feeling valued at work over and over and over again. It is a very common theme. Harvard Business Review has mentioned this. There are other national publications out there that talk about feeling valued at work. And it's huge. It's huge. And, of course, one of the ideas is that we buy into status. We buy into status. There's a great urban legend, and I don't know if it's true, but University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is sort of the de facto flagship university in my state. And there's a folklore story from the 1960s that apparently there were students in an economics class, and so these were high achieving students who were econ majors studying economics at the University of Chapel Hill. So they had bright rosy futures in front of them, because this premier state institution, they are studying econ. Many of them came from pretty affluent families. They had their life mapped out for them, and this is an urban legend, but the truth of it makes it worth telling. So apparently the professor said to them, there is going to be a final exam, but there are only going to be 2 questions on the final exam. Only 2 questions. And again, keep in mind, this is, I think, late 60s, early 70s. So the students get there and they take the exam. And the first question is, name one person by name who works in the cafeteria where you have lunch every single day. And question number 2 is, tell me one significant thing about their lives. So this was this UNC professor, and again, this probably is a story. More, it could have a grounding in truth, but the broader truth that it's communicating is that these elite students who were on their way to elite jobs as economists coming out of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the 60s and 70s, that they bought into a belief about status that this professor wanted to challenge them on. There's a brilliant songwriter, composer, Broadway performer named Tim Minchin. I think he may be from New Zealand or Australia, and forgive me for not knowing which one, but Tim Minchin, he does a commencement address, probably the best commencement address I've ever seen. It's 9 minutes long. You can find it on YouTube. But Tim Minchin, in his brilliant, very brief commencement address, he says, I have literally been sitting at tables talking about multi-million dollar entertainment deals with big time folks, and I have decided to do the deal or not do the deal based on how they treated the wait staff. And so society has told us that there are jobs that have more status than others. And honestly, I think probably there are jobs that have more status than others. That does not mean in any way that the people doing those jobs have less status. And we need to have that. That is a mindset that is critical for all leaders. I do see sometimes CEOs doing this performatively, right? They make all their staff wear name tags so that they can be sort of seen saying hi to the guy who sweeps the floors, right? But the idea that we should always be that we could ever or should ever conflate status of positions, status of roles, with status of people, we real leaders have to break that apart. They have to blow that whole thing up, right? So every person is deserving of human dignity. Every person is deserving of human dignity. And that's a key mindset. If you don't believe that, you're going to have a hard time really, really being a leader. You are. If you believe that there are some people out there that don't deserve human dignity, that's going to make it hard for you to lead, because maybe someone you're trying to lead is in a category of people that you don't think deserves full human dignity. Well, they're not going to respond to you. They will sense it from you that you don't really believe that they are deserving of human dignity, full human dignity. But also, sometimes you might believe a certain class of person, whether it has to do with their documentation status or their sexual orientation or their gender identity or their nationality or their level of education or their ability status or disability status, however we perceive of other people. If you as a leader are holding on to this idea that someone, whether it's someone you supervise or not someone you supervise, but someone who you don't supervise, that there are classes of people that do not deserve human dignity, trust me when I say, even if you're not supervising someone in one of those categories, you're supervising someone who loves someone in one of those categories. And that's important. That's important. So feeling valued at work is something that so many people want. And the leadership mindset that accompanies that is that every person is deserving of human dignity, period, full stop. Yeah. And then the last one, authenticity matters. The opposite of authenticity matters is I really can't trust my supervisor or supervisors, right? Trust shows up in a lot of different ways. And so one of the things that's interesting, I mentioned I do work with the Myers-Briggs. One thing that's interesting is if you're familiar with the Myers-Briggs, you may know that the middle two letters, so the second letter is sensing or intuition, and the third letter is feeling or thinking. So sensing or intuition is how you absorb the world around you. Thinking and feeling is how you make decisions. And those two middle letters are pretty critical in most workplace environments where it comes to building teams, communicating effectively with each other, and building trust. And so it's interesting because depending on one's Myers-Briggs type, I would hear things like, well, I can't trust my supervisor to meet deadlines. I can't trust my supervisor to follow through. Other times, it's I can't trust my supervisor to be honest with me. I can't trust my supervisor to not gossip about people, etc. So some of the things that the trust gets attached to, or the lack of trust gets attached to, some of them sort of follow different Myers-Briggs types. Some of them follow the types that want more structure, more follow through, more consistency. Others want trust in their honesty, their forthrightness, their integrity, right? But no matter the flavor of the trust you want with supervisors, which is flavored heavily by our personality type, no matter the flavor, overwhelmingly people want to be able to trust their supervisors. And if they can't, those supervisors overwhelmingly are failing them. I'm going to pause for a second and see if anybody has any comments in the chat. I will open the chat on the Google Meet as well, because we have some people over here on the LinkedIn on this side and on the Google Meet over on this side. So I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions. While I'm pausing, Let me just mention that my book is available now. It has been out for about a month, and so here's my book, Leading with Emotional Intelligence, and I'll show it to you all too. Leading with Emotional Intelligence. It's available now on my website, adaptivechallengeconsulting.com. Also, I don't know if anybody here, and I would love for people to chime in on where they are in the world. I don't know if anybody's in Central North Carolina, but I'm in Greensboro, North Carolina, which, if you're unfamiliar, is part of Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and High Point, which is the Triad Metro region. And I just realized my camera's on over here. And so if anybody's in Central North Carolina, I'm having a book signing event tonight at 6 p.m. And so here's my book, and it's going to be at Scuppernong Books downtown in Greensboro. But if I don't see any questions, I will continue on. So yeah, so this is the list. These are the 5 key mindsets. And so even though I went through the opposites, I'm just going to real quickly reiterate that before leaders go about the business of building skills. And again, when you think about, if you've been through trainings facilitated by your HR departments, or you've been through trainings that are at conferences, oftentimes they start with skills. These are the skills you need to do. These are the skills you need to do. And they don't start with mindsets. There are certain skills that if you try to develop them without first adopting certain mindsets, the skills just are not going to develop. They're not really going to develop in a substantial, meaningful way, because developing a skill around something that you don't believe isn't going to embed. And again, at the beginning of this, I talked about the difference between sort of behavior-based leadership and developmental leadership. Developmental leadership definitely includes behaviors, but it includes not just the behavior, but what's going on in here as you are exhibiting this behavior. Because behaviors that are faked, staff picks up on that. Team members pick up on that. Things that are forced, team members pick up on that, right? So making sure to get these 5 mindsets in place first before you go into your next professional development to build more skills is critical. So again, we never become the perfect leader. Y'all have read about the growth mindset, I'm sure, but the idea is that we never become the perfect leader. Again, I want to acknowledge that this is an easier thing to admit when you come from a culture that has systemic power, right? White men, for example, right? It's harder to do, or I don't know if it's harder to do, but there's a bigger price to pay when you are part of a minoritized group. Because saying I don't know takes courage for anybody, but saying I don't know, if you're a woman, you unfairly bear the mantle of all women and worry about the stereotypes of women, etc., in ways that men don't have to deal with that. Same with the Black community, same with the Latinx community, same with the disabled community, same with the indigenous community, same with several communities that have less power. There is just a higher price to pay to adopt the growth mindset as a leader and to say, I know I'm not perfect. There's a price to, there's a social price to pay for that, right? So if you're a leader who does not have to pay that social price, be aware and use that awareness to mitigate the social price for leaders that you know that have those intersecting identities. I'm going to say that one more time. If you, for example, if you're not a disabled person and you recognize that there are leaders in your organization or your community who have a disability, that you should use the privilege afforded to you by not being a disabled person to make sure that in the hallway, people aren't questioning the disabled person's competence in a way that is more about their disability than it is about their work, right? And I mentioned disability as one status, but you can do this across any dynamic, race. There's a story I told on a podcast recently about I was at part of a national association in student affairs, and I was at a meeting, and I was on the board. My job was to help all the state chapters of our national association be effective, and we were having a robust conversation. And the president of the Colorado chapter, Margaret, spoke up and said something, and the room went about its business. Margaret was a Black woman, by the way. The second woman who spoke up was Stacy, who was the president of the Georgia chapter, who was another Black woman, who said something pretty similar to what Margaret said. And the room kind of went on about its business. And then my colleague, Brandon, who was next to me, who's a Black man, raised his hand and said the same thing. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, Brandon, tell us more, right? He knew what he was doing though, because he was like, hey, did y'all not hear it when Margaret said it? Did you not hear it when Stacy said it? He corrected the room in real time, inviting the room to reflect on why is it that when he said it, people leaned in with curiosity and wanted to know more. And when those two black women had said it, they weren't getting listened to the same degree. And I think he even like elbowed me and said, could you imagine if Mueller had said it, who's not just a man, but a white man too, right? That there might have been an extra bit of listening to me. So the question is, right, how do we, if when we think about this first one, we never become a perfect leader, when you recognize that there are folks for whom admitting that has a higher cost, and if it doesn't have a higher cost for you, start disrupting the side chatter about their competence. Start disrupting that. Yeah. The second one, everything starts with listening. Again, I took an entire course in grad school called Helping Skills, and half of that graduate course was just on teaching how to be an active listener. And so teaching me to, I started learning the skill, but it wasn't until midway through the class that I really understood why it's always important, not just a skill I should build. So the second half of the course, suddenly my skill building, once I believed in the value of listening, my skill building grew exponentially. And I know that this sounds weird, right? But the idea is just that that doing active listening when you don't actually believe that everyone needs to be listened to it's only going to get you so far as a leader. Number three, perspective taking is valuable. And this is huge, not just across identities, but also in terms of relationships with your organization, right? I worked at many colleges and universities. I was a banker. I was a mortgage lender in a previous life. I sold cars once. I sold cell phones for Radio Shack in a mall, which I know I'm dating myself saying Radio Shack out loud. But perspective taking is valuable when it comes to your clients, your customers, your students, your constituents, whoever it is you serve, right? And so, for example, I do some work with city governments, and I was doing some work with a city government in sort of Central Florida. And one of the things that's important is that they want to have good customer service, but everyone who works for that city government knows how the city government inner workings work. They know what office does what, they know what forms do what. And so when people call them, people who are just going about their business, they don't necessarily know what office does what. They don't necessarily know what form does what. And so when I do work with city governments, county governments, colleges and universities, sometimes K-12 systems, on what I call aware and inclusive customer service, right? Aware and inclusive customer service. So the idea is that the person asking you for help doesn't know which departments do which necessarily. They don't know what forms do what. And so you can adopt two mindsets. You can either, one, explain the system, which this is the most common. When I'm on with tech support, I don't know if you've had this experience, you're on with tech support, and tech support is explaining to you, well, I have to refer you to this department, and then they have to complete this, and then you're going to work with this department. If you've ever had that conversation, which I think most of us have, it's clear that that organization has not adopted a mindset of the value of perspective taking, because they are just explaining the system to you. The other version of aware and inclusive customer service is what I call company for the journey, where someone comes to the office at your city government or in your K-12 administrative building or your university or your business HR department. They come for a certain thing, and instead of you just saying, oh, you need to talk to this office, you say, hey, hold on, I'm going to call this office while you're still here to make sure that we're good, to send them over, make sure you know where you're going, where you become company for the journey of that customer, that client, that student, that constituent, whoever they are to your organization. So perspective taking, even though in my book I spend a fair amount of time talking about perspective taking when it comes to our race and our gender, because I think these things are critical for leaders. And perspective taking is also about your relationship with an institution. Many faculty who I worked with at colleges and universities were brilliant educators, and they didn't necessarily understand how the registration system at their university worked, or they didn't necessarily understand the forms and processes students would need to start a club on campus, or that students don't necessarily understand the scope and the scale and the outcomes of new student orientation. And so there's a lot of things about their own system that they don't experience, and because they don't experience that, they might not have expertise, and so they're not doing some perspective taking, right? So one of the things that I always thought was funny, and I don't know how many higher ed people might be on the call, is that overwhelmingly most presidents and vice chancellors of universities and colleges were academics who were prolific in being history professors and chemistry professors, and but they were that most of these leaders of universities came from the PhD crowd, and the PhD crowd represents about 1% of the population of the US, right? So if you look at an average college, 99% of those students are not the kind of student who have the focus or ambition or intelligence or whatever combination of those things. Is never one of those things, but some whatever the combination is to go do a doctorate. And yet universities and colleges overwhelmingly are run by people with doctorates who came from that 1% of either motivation or smarts, or motivation plus smarts, or motivation plus smarts plus privilege plus access to systems. Whatever the thing was, if you rewind the clock of the average PhD leaders in these systems, many of them were a lot different than the students they were teaching. And so I would hear professors lament all the time, well, it's in the syllabus. Why didn't you read the syllabus? Because there's a bell curve, and some students will read them. Those are your students who are probably going to go into grad school anyway. Some will skim them. That was kind of me. And some of them won't read them at all, because not all of them are as academically focused, and it's hard to remember. It's hard to remember if you have a PhD in geology or British literature or whatever. It's hard to rewind your mind to the perspective of what it was like before you had that level of focus, commitment to academic study, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So perspective taking, sure, it can be about our identities, but it can also, for leaders, be a very important way to map and understand the different constituent groups that you are serving or doing commerce with, or whatever your relationship with is. Number 4, all people are deserving of human dignity. This ought not be up for debate, and yet it gets politicized across a few different lines, right? I'm not going to pretend. I mean, I live in the U.S. I'm not going to pretend that there are not governments at the state level and federal level who would argue whether or not transgender people are deserving of full human dignity, or whether gay people or bisexual people are deserving of full human dignity, or people here either undocumented or people who are on a particular kind of visa. That there are people trying to make whether human dignity is deserved of all people. There are people trying to make that political, but it's not. It's not. All people deserve human dignity, period, full stop. And if there are people who want to say they are leaders or want to be leaders who do not believe that, they are never really going to be great leaders. They're just not. They might be effective managers, but managing is a different standard. Managing is getting people to comply with what you want to do to reach your goals. That's management. Your goals are the company goals. Leadership is a holistic understanding that each person is valuable, that each person that's contributing to your business's goal or your nonprofit's goal or whatever, that they each also have their own goals, and that they are each also working on their own resume, their own career path. That understanding that all people are deserving of human dignity can shift things. One example is I had probably my favorite assistant director. I was a director of a center, and my favorite assistant director I knew would have lots of opportunities outside of where she worked with us. We were not a high-paying organization. And I said to her once, I knew she was applying for a job, and I think she had asked me to be a reference, which I was happy to do. And I said, this math is going to be the most messed up math ever, but I am 100% invested in you staying here. And I am 100% invested in you finding the place that's going to maximize your skill and your joy and your fulfillment and your fit and your effectiveness with those you serve, right? And so I know 100 plus 100, that doesn't really exist, but part of this is that I fully believe that she was, deserving of full human dignity in every measure, which means I had to be equally as invested in having her around to serve those who my mission was asking us to serve, and equally invested in her growing beyond us, right? And then the last one, just to wrap it up, is that authenticity matters. And this is something that, if you looked at the Harvard Business Review, for example, if you looked at lists of theirs from prior to like 2010, 2009, emotionally intelligent competences weren't high on the list. Or sometimes there'd be one that would say something like multicultural awareness or intercultural awareness or something like that. But if you look at those lists, how they've evolved, now easily 3 of the 10 have to do with variations on themes of emotional intelligence. And one of the biggest ones is authenticity. One of the things that people probably realize but don't talk about is that baby boomers got information overwhelmingly from newspapers and the 6 o'clock news, right? Gen Xers overwhelmingly got news and information from the 6 o'clock news, and then later in their life, some other news sources and the young internet when it was young. Millennials very much have gotten news from the internet, and through the millennials experienced the brunt of the information age as the pace of news sources increased so much, but yet the old norms of journalism, etc., were still overwhelmingly in place up to a point. And Gen Z, bless their hearts, is having to navigate the misinformation era, the misinformation age. And so Gen Z, a lot of times at conferences, you'll hear these alarmist things. This generation gets inundated with this many images a day, or this many images a week, or it spends this much time on screens, and blah blah blah. And that's it's okay to talk about it in that way. When my father was in college, and they put the first television in the first floor of the residence hall, where everybody, the entire residence hall, had to share one television to watch one of 3 channels. People thought society was doomed because there was going to be a television in the residence halls, right? By the time I was in college, every other room in my residence hall had a television, and a few of them even had cable, where we had like 13 channels or 14 channels. I think there was even like 1 or 2 VCRs. Oh my gosh, right? And that was, of course, the doom of civilization, whatever. So one of the things the reason I'm bringing that up is because Gen Z is facing the misinformation age. And so their thirst for authenticity is going to be even higher than the thirst of the millennials, which is even going to be higher than those of Gen X. And Gen X really wanted authenticity, right? So what you got to understand is that the newer generations are being given so much information, some of it's good information, some of it's misinformation, some of it's disinformation. They're being given all this. And even though at conferences, I'll hear a keynote speaker get up there and say, yeah, can you believe that they're spending this many hours on a screen? And then all the boomers and the Gen Xers and the older millennials grasp our pearls and go, oh my gosh, society's coming to an end. But without getting into the context of what this means. What does it mean? And what does it mean, the different kinds of information they're getting? So anybody who's been to some of my recent keynotes knows that I think after the misinformation, the disinformation age, I think the next age is going to be called the discernment age. We have so much information. We can make deep fakes with our phones now in ways that discernment is going to be more and more critical. So when I say discernment, and when I'm talking about number 5, authenticity matters, what I'm saying is that authenticity is about the ability to be as real as possible about what matters most. As real as possible about what matters most. That's what I mean in this case by authenticity. And that's what those who are being led want from their leaders. Because I could see something that is factual on the internet that affects 0.17% of people, and it's factual, and it does affect that small percentage of people. But then I can see something else where the fact is slightly off, but the phenomenon they're describing, even though the statistic, it says 76% of people deal with this, and really it's 74%, but the phenomenon they're describing is affecting a large percentage of people. Even if part of the fact being presented is wrong, the relative impact of that phenomenon that's being discussed is more important. So when it comes to being authentic, what it's about is not just about what's true and false, but what's most critical and relevant, right? And so that is a huge part of authenticity that all leaders will need, especially if we are to round the corner, or when we round the corner from the misinformation age or the disinformation age into the discernment age. All right, y'all. So thank you so much for spending some time today. We went about 45 minutes here, I guess. And so, real quick, if you're local, if you're in the Greensboro, North Carolina area, if you want to come down to Scuppernong's Books today at 6 p.m., we're doing a book event and signing. Otherwise, though, my book is available online. So if you buy it from my website, that's the best. You can also get it on Amazon and other sources. But when you buy it on my website, I get to send it to you directly, which is great. It's great for me. It's great for my kids' college fund when I'm able to ship the books directly. And one thing I'll close with is just where this book came from. 25 years ago, I created an email address, and the email address was called allensleadershipbook@gmail.com. And every time I saw an example of good leadership or bad leadership, I sent myself an email. I wasn't much of a journaler that had the discipline to journal every day, but I had this random email address, and I would just randomly send emails. Sometimes it's a politician doing something that I thought was particularly noteworthy that exemplified an aspect of leadership. Sometimes it was somebody where I worked who was doing good leadership or bad leadership, and I would just send that email a little reflection, and it was random and it was all over the place. And I opened it for the first time 2 years ago and had pretty much a book ready to go. So it was, and what it was also amazing is that in the intervening years, I've had so many clients, and so those clients have taught me by what they are asking for. They've taught me by what they wish they had in their leaders, and also along the lines, I got a doctorate in leadership. And so these three things of me observing leadership in the field, me studying in an academic sense what leadership is, what's meant by leadership, what leadership actually is, how we can measure it, how we can find whether we are doing effective leadership training or not. A lot of leadership training makes people feel good for 2 days, and then it doesn't change much after that, right? So how do we measure whether leadership training is effective? And then these clients that I've heard from for 25 years and formally really for more than a decade, when I sort of started at After Challenge Consulting. And so that's all poured into this book. So I'm very, very proud of this book. Anyway, next week is our next session. So go ahead and go to Adaptive Challenge Consulting on LinkedIn, RSVP to it, invite some friends to the conversation. But next week should be exciting as well. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining me, and have a great rest of your Thursday. Take care.